Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 591. Got pride? This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I got to walk again this morning. I got to talk to everyone last night. It was good. Life is great. And there was fog over the river this morning. That, to me, is just spectacular beauty. I love fog over, well, honestly, over anything. But it was particularly lovely this morning walking over the Delaware. So that was great. And I have some coolness for you. The first thing is I want to share something that Anne Blanton did. Over the last few weeks, Anne, who often is on the Tuesday morning for me call on the Zoom chat, she mentioned that she was going to go take a class, so she was going to miss the next Tuesday. She started sending me pictures of what she was doing in the class, and my mind was frozen in a consistently blown status while she was sending these to me because it was so beautiful what she's doing. She's an amazing quilter. I have gotten the most beautiful cards from her that she quilts the cards. I mean, it's just amazing what Anne can do. One of those things that she can do now is a ridiculous amount of fussy cutting, which if you've never seen that done before, you will if you go to craftlit.com/591 and you take a look at the PDF. It's attached to this particular episode as well, so you should be able to download it even if you're not at the show notes. Take a look at the step-by-step pictures on the PDF because wow, just wow. The class that she took was one that was done by Laura, I think it's Heine. It's Heine. It's either Heine or Heine. Wow. If you go to her website, and I've linked out to it from the show notes, it's fiberworks-heine.com. So fiberworks, all one word, HEINE.com. You can see all of the fabulousness. You can also see all of the kits in case you aren't able to go to one of the in-person classes. So yeah, wowza, just spectacular. I just regularly bow in front of Anne's superior color choices and fabric choices and skill with the needle. It's just a lot of fun to watch. The second thing I wanted to share with you is I've been looking for about 10 years now for a lap desk, an antique lap desk, much like the one in Northanger Abbey. I have found dozens online on eBay, in person, that were always really beautiful, some of them far too big, but also ridiculously expensive. I found one a couple months ago on eBay for a negotiable amount of money because it wasn't perfect. Some of the veneering had come off. There was no key with which to lock it, which became a giant saga. It wasn't in perfect shape. What it was, though, was in really, really good shape. Everything that was wrong with it, except for the key, that was wrong with it was cosmetic and fixable. So I talked back and forth with the sellers who were in Peoria, Arizona, and we arrived at a solution, and I bought it. And it got here, and I started immediately cleaning it, and then I had to test it to find out if it was covered in shellac or lacquer, because depending on which one it was, I would have to treat the repair work that I was doing differently. So I had to learn all about that. I had to learn about, I loved this, gel stain, which has rocked my world. I am so deeply in love with gel stain at this point. The difference between wood patch, wood filler, plastic wood, there are so many different things it could be. I wasn't sure at one point if I was going to conquer this, but I did. And I've uploaded pictures for you so that you can see it, because the coolest thing about it is it has its little tray. This is the kind of lap desk that it's a box. And when you open it, when you unlock it and open it, you wind up with usually a leather or velvet covered writing surface. In this case, it's leather. And then there's usually a little kind of tray at the top end. So it's a sloped writing surface, which helps a lot if you're working with fountain pen or dip pen, but it also helps your wrist quite a bit. And by putting this little tray section at the top of the writing surface, you have a place to put pens, and usually there's some kind of inkwell. Sometimes the inkwell is an actual ink bottle that is right there. It's, usually a little crystal bottle. Sometimes it has a screw-on cap, sometimes it has a flip-down cap. Either way, it occurred to me at some point that trying to find one with a bottle intact was probably a waste of my time because none of those bottles were going to seal well enough for anyone to leave ink in them. So that made the hunt a lot easier. So the one I found has the little tray for a pen, and it's kind of interesting because if you push down on one side of that little pen tray, and it's this beautiful marbled wood that's been carved into a concave shape so that pens actually rest down in the tray. If you push on one end of it, it flips up, and it's designed to do that. So you could put like stamps under there, and they wouldn't get flung all about hither and thither when you move around the box when it's closed. So that's cool. And then there's another little compartment, not super huge, but interestingly had folded metal sides. Everything else on this sucker is wood, except for the latches and things like that. But this folded metal, it's not shiny, it's not pretty, it doesn't seem to be any particularly spectacular metal that's been used. It's just there, and it's functional, and it's a little wobbly, which is interesting. And then there's the inkwell, the little divot. It's maybe 1.5 inches deep, almost 1 3/4 inches deep at the tallest point, which means you're going to need a tiny little bottle to put in there if you're going to have some ink in there. So there aren't that many tiny little bottles out there in the world. I have checked. Instead, what I found was that a long time ago, someone had given me one of those little boxed pocket sets of something. Like you could get a boxed sand Zen garden that comes with a tiny little 2-inch by 1.5 inch tray and a tiny little bag of white sand and a tiny little rake. And often these are in checkout lines at Barnes & Noble or at other bookstores or curio shops or gift shops. I had one that someone gave me that was for pen and ink writing and penmanship. I don't know if that was an insult to my penmanship, but if it was an accurate insult to my penmanship. In there was a small dip pen and a small bottle of ink. And I opened it up, and boy, does that sucker seal well. It sealed so well, I made a mess when I opened it the first time. But it's good. It's solid. It's not going to leak. And it's very small. It's only about 1.25 inches tall. Perfect. So that problem was solved. Pens solved. I then get an email from the original owners, the sellers, and they said, "Oh, by the way, we forgot to tell you, we are pretty sure there is a secret compartment underneath where the pen and inkwell trays are. You can tell because the vertical bit that goes down the side that blocks it off from the rest of the case, where you have your stationery stored and stuff like that, it's loose. It's oddly loose, and it sure looks like it's supposed to open, but we couldn't find out how to open it." So I went immediately and started looking and saying, yes, my gosh, they're right. This is oddly loose, and you can see where the wood has been hand trimmed kind of strangely. But then I looked at it again, and there's like maybe not quite 1/4 inch, maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7 millimeter gap at the bottom. And sure enough, the gap goes all the way to the edge. So you could put a considerably larger piece of paper into this compartment as long as you slide the edges of the paper underneath where that ink and pen tray is. It was very odd. I could not figure out how to open it either, and decided that what I really needed to focus on was getting this thing locked, because it wasn't going to do me a bloody bit of good if I couldn't lock the thing. So originally I thought, well, all I have to do is learn how to pick a lock, because if I can pick the lock, then I can manipulate it, because it's an old enough lock that I could look inside and see it's not rusted shut. The little hooky things that come up as part of the locking device are certainly mobile. They wiggle freely. We're just missing the key. Picking this lock turned out to be a non-starter. It's a long story. So instead, I started hunting for a locksmith nearby who did more than just come and open your door or replace a door lock for you. I found somebody who was capable of grinding their own key. So the first key that he said worked, he swore blind it worked, did not. I'd gone to pick the lap desk up when the locksmith wasn't there. So it was just the guy working at the counter, and I handed the box back to him and I said, "Okay, I may be doing this wrong. I know he showed this to you. Can you try this, please, and show me how I'm doing it wrong?" And the guy tried the key too, and he said, "I do not know what to tell you. I know that when the locksmith was here, he showed me that it opened. I have no idea what's going on. I'll take it back and have him regrind the key." And I said, "Okay," because it was very clear that the little, it looked like a skeleton key. The part that hangs down, the part that's actually going to lock or unlock the lock, was actually too deep. The depth of space between the end of the lock and the front edge of the lock was very narrow, and this key just seriously wasn't going to fit. So I don't know how he got it in there before. He was going to have to regrind it. So so then I get a text message from him saying, "Hey, I figured out how to open the secret compartment, and I'll show you when I get this back to you. But that's only the good news. There's also some bad news. And the bad news is that I broke it." And I was heartbroken because I thought, "Oh my God, how are you ever going to get this lock replaced?" And before I could even do anything more than, write back a sad face on text, he wrote again and he said, "And the other problem is I'm leaving for South Carolina for a week, but when I get back, we have two choices. Either I can give the box back to you and not charge you anything, or when I get back, I can try fixing it. I just got some new brass bonding goo that I would love to test, and I think I can fix this." And I wrote back and said, "Keep it as long as you need to. Have a great time in South Carolina. I can't wait to hear how this goes when you come back." So a week after he was supposed to have gotten back from South Carolina, I texted him again and said, "All right, what's the situation? How's it going? Have you had a chance to look at it? How's the bonding going?" And he said, "Well, I decided not to do the bonding. I just rebuilt the lock." Again, my mind is blown. I don't know how he did this. He did actually hand cut pieces of metal that are now the lock mechanism on this thing. And there's a very small little skeleton key that works. Barely. It feels very delicate, but it does work. So I was so excited. And this was my birthday week when this all happened. And I wrote back, "Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. I can't believe you did that. That's great." And he said, "Yeah, I haven't even told you how much it's going to cost yet." And I wrote back and said, "Okay, maybe I'm not so excited, question mark." And he said, "I honestly don't know how to charge you for this. I can't I can't charge you by the hour because it would be ridiculous. And I don't know what you're comfortable with." And I wrote back and said, "Okay, I actually really understand this because I am surrounded by makers and creators of things. And just like with knitting somebody a sweater, there is no way you could charge by the hour without nobody ever being able to afford a sweater. So I understand what you're saying. This was my budget for buying the box. I got the box for slightly less than that. How about I pay you the same as what I bought for the box? Because the box was not going to be usable if I couldn't get a key. It's another month out. I now have the money again. How's that?" And he said, "That's too much. How about this?" And he gave me a counteroffer. And I said, "Yes." "Okay. And I'm going to tell everybody I know about how awesome you are." So, yeah, I got the box back and it worked. And when I picked it up at the shop, the guy showed me that those little metal sides that looked so incongruous amongst all this beautiful marbled wood, one side, the one on the inkwell side, if you lifted it straight up, like you just pinch the metal and pull straight up, it lifted a latch underneath, and the wooden panel that seemed not to be set particularly well explodes out from the side of the inkwell and pen tray because there's a piece of metal that is a spring that's in there. And so it's being held in under tension. And when you lift that little metal side to the inkwell, it slides up, releasing that spring, and bam! You've got definitely space to slide paper underneath, but you also have two little drawers. And I've uploaded pictures of these too. So in one of the drawers, I now have sealing wax ink. And in the other drawer, I have a sealing wax melting spoon. I have my sealing wax stamp in that little metal tray, the weird one, and my ink in the inkwell, and some pens in the pen tray, and stationery. And now, whenever I get the urge to write to people, and I'm going to force myself to write to people on paper more often now because I have a reason to, I can do it in comfort so my wrist doesn't start to hurt. And I can do it with pens that I like, which made me really happy. So, wow, that was a really long story about a simple lap desk. But if you ever find yourself in a position where you get one of these and there's been damage done to the wood, you just let me know and I will be happy to help you out on that. In fact, I can probably send you some of the things that I used because I don't think I am ever going to use them again. It was a lot of fun, and I learned an awful lot about wood and preserving wood and cleaning wood and all the different things that you can do to keep something that is very old looking very young. This thing is, we are estimating that this thing is about 150, between 150 and 200 years old from the way the lock was built and the engraving on the top. There's still a little engraved bit at the top. It was a lap desk that was originally given by a son and a daughter to their father. And it's kind of cool. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. The other thing, I obviously have a lot of pride about what I did with the desk, but I also have a lot of pride this week because this is Pride Week in New Hope and Lambertville. I'm uploading this morning some photographs that I took in Lambertville and in New Hope of people getting ready for the Pride Parade. Tomorrow morning for the Pride Parade, Aiden, thing two, will once again be reprising his, I think 4 years ago was the first time he did it, carrying the 100-foot long, thank you, Candy, the 100-foot long rainbow flag from Lambertville across the New Hope Lambertville Bridge and into New Hope where the parade ends. So we will be down and watching that and very excited to be prideful parents once again at the parade. So it's just a good, happy, friendly, loving time here on both sides of the Delaware. And that's nice. And it's also nice because our chapters for Joan today are also largely happy. Doesn't look like they're both going to be happy, but they are happy. So let's talk about Joan for a sec. All right, the chapters today are not difficult. There's nothing that you need me for. The only thing I will tell you going into this is everything is true in these two chapters. Not necessarily the dialogue, although the one time the dialogue is true, Mark Twain puts a footnote in because he's, as you will recall, really, really serious about this book. And he really, really wants people to know where those unbelievable moments are, or those places where you would say, oh, yeah, sure, that's what happened. That's just Twain being Twain. No, actually, this time it's not. Which I still just, it makes me smile every time I hear him do something like that in this book, because he's trying so hard to be a different kind of writer than he is. And sometimes he succeeds and sometimes not so much. The other reason why there's not a whole lot for me to give you this week is because these two chapters are very much those moving the chess pieces on the board chapters. It's almost like ready, steady, and then next week we get to go. So chapter 12, our first chapter today, is Joan puts heart in her army, and the second for today, chapter 13, is checked by the folly of the wise. And just from the title, you know that this is one of those things Mark Twain loves to ridicule people for. If you present yourself as someone who knows more, knows better, knows everything, and then you blow it, Twain loves that. He loves popping the balloons of those people who are puffed up with their own greatness, and also loves his underdogs. Huck and Jim being two of the most heartbreaking underdogs possibly ever written. It's not a surprise that even though Joan has God and the angels on her side, Twain would still look at her as an underdog to be championed. The one thing that I will say is not so true about the descriptions in today's chapters are In the Trial of Reconciliation and the other texts of contemporary texts about Joan, people didn't really talk about her being so beautiful. They talked occasionally about that kind of inner beauty that you get from being on your mission. They definitely talked about her being small, because she was. But the events that take place in today's chapters are verified in several different places. And when Twain's footnote mentions the authority of Michelet, Michelet was one of the biographers who had written in French. I don't even know if it's been translated at this point. Written in French. This is one of the books that Twain read in French and that he heavily footnoted his copy of. That's why I get kind of irked when people blow this book off and say, oh, well, that's just Twain being Twain. He didn't really do any work. He didn't actually research this. No, yes, he did. And if anybody had gone to look at the books in the Twain library, and there are photostatic copies of these things, there's barely a page that he didn't write on, often in French himself, which I think I've mentioned before. So Michelet was one of those two original books that translated quite a bit of Joan of Arc's contemporary texts, the records from her trial of condemnation and the trial of reconciliation. So Michelet is somebody who Twain trusted. He certainly found everything that Michelet said about Joan to be accurate to all the other texts that Twain went and looked at in the National Archives in Paris. So these are two chapters you can trust. And with that, let's listen to Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, Book 2, Chapters 12 and 13, read for us by John Greenman. Here we go.
Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, Volume 1, Book 2, Chapter 12. Joan puts heart in her army. We were at Blois 3 days. Oh, that camp! It is one of the treasures of my memory. Order? There was no more order among those brigands than there is among the wolves and the hyenas. They went roaring and drinking about, whooping, shouting, swearing, and entertaining themselves with all manner of rude and riotous horseplay. And the place was full of loud and lewd women, and they were no whit behind the men for romps and noise and fantastics. It was in the midst of this wild mob that Noel and I had our first glimpse of La Hire. He answered to our dearest dreams. He was of great size and of martial bearing. He was cased in mail from head to heel, with a bushel of swishing plumes on his helmet, and at his side the vast sword of the time. He was on his way to pay his respects in state to Joan, and as he passed through the camp he was restoring order, and proclaiming that the Maid had come, and he would have no such spectacle as this exposed to the head of the army. His way of creating order was his own, not borrowed. He did it with his great fists. As he moved along, swearing and admonishing, he let drive this way, that way, and the other, and wherever his blow landed, a man went down. "Damn you," he said, "staggering and cursing around like this, and the commander-in-chief in the camp, straighten up!" And he laid the man flat. What his idea of straightening up was his own secret. We followed the veteran to headquarters, listening, observing, admiring, yes, devouring, you may say, the pet hero of the boys of France from our cradles up to that happy day, and their idol and ours. I called to mind how Joan had once rebuked the paladin, there in the pastures of Domremy, for uttering lightly those mighty names, La Hire and the Bastard of Orleans, and how she said that if she could but be permitted to stand afar off and let her eyes rest once upon those great men, she would hold it a privilege. They were to her and the other girls just what they were to the boys. Well, here was one of them at last, and what was his errand? It was hard to realize, and yet it was true. He was coming to uncover his head before her and take her orders. While he was quieting a considerable group of his brigands in his soothing way near headquarters, we stepped on ahead and got a glimpse of Joan's military family, the great chiefs of the army, for they had all arrived now. There they were, 6 officers of wide renown, handsome men in beautiful armor. But the Lord High Admiral of France was the handsomest of them all, and had the most gallant bearing. When La Hire entered, one could see the surprise in his face at Joan's beauty and extreme youth, and one could see, too, by Joan's glad smile, that it had made her happy to get sight of this hero of her childhood at last. La Hire bowed low, with his helmet in his gauntleted hand, and made a bluff but handsome little speech, with hardly an oath in it, and one could see that those two took to each other on the spot. The visit of ceremony was soon over, and the others went away, but La Hire stayed, and he and Joan sat there, and he sipped her wine, and they talked and laughed together like old friends. And presently she gave him some instructions, in his quality as master of the camp, which made his breath stand still. For, to begin with, she said that all those loose women must pack out of the place at once. She wouldn't allow one of them to remain. Next, the rough carousing must stop. Drinking must be brought within proper and strictly defined limits, and discipline must take the place of disorder. And finally she climaxed the list of surprises with this, which nearly lifted him out of his armor: "Every man who joins my standard must confess before the priest and absolve himself from sin, and all accepted recruits must be present at divine service twice a day." La Hire could not say a word for a good part of a minute. Then he said, in deep dejection, "Oh, sweet child, they were littered in hell, these poor darlings of mine. Attend mass? Why, dear heart, they'll see us both damned first." And he went on, pouring out a most pathetic stream of arguments and blasphemy, which broke Joan all up and made her laugh as she had not laughed since she played in Domremy pastures. It was good to hear. But she stuck to her point. So the soldier yielded and said all right, if such were the orders he must obey, and would do the best that was in him. Then he refreshed himself with a lurid explosion of oaths, and said that if any man in the camp refused to renounce sin and lead a pious life, he would knock his head off. That started Joan off again. She was really having a good time, you see. But she would not consent to that form of conversions. She said they must be voluntary. La Hire said that that was all right, he wasn't going to kill the voluntary ones, but only the others. No matter, none of them must be killed, Joan couldn't have it. She said that to give a man a chance to volunteer, on pain of death if he didn't, left him more or less trammeled, and she wanted him to be entirely free. So the soldier sighed and said he would advertise the mass, but said he doubted if there was a man in camp that was any more likely to go to it than he was himself. Then there was another surprise for him, for Joan said, "But, dear man, you are going." "I? Impossible! Oh, this is lunacy." "Oh, no, it isn't. You are going to the service, twice a day."
"Oh, am I dreaming? Am I drunk? Or is my hearing playing me false? Why, I would rather go to—"
"Never mind where. In the morning you are going to begin, and after that it will come easy. Now don't look downhearted like that. Soon you won't mind it." La Hire tried to cheer up, but he was not able to do it. He sighed like a zephyr, and presently said,
"Well, I'll do it for you. But before I would do it for another, I swear I—"
"But don't swear. Break it off."
"Break it off? It is impossible. I beg you to—why, oh, my General, it is my native speech."
He begged so hard for grace for his impediment that Joan left him one fragment of it. She said he might swear by his baton, the symbol of his generalship. He promised that he would swear only by his baton when in her presence, and would try to modify himself elsewhere, but doubted he could manage it, now that it was so old and stubborn a habit, and such a solace and support to his declining years. That tough old lion went away from there a good deal tamed and civilized, not to say softened and sweetened, for perhaps those expressions would hardly fit him. Noel and I believed that when he was away from Joan's influence his old aversions would come up so strong in him that he could hardly master them, and so wouldn't go to mass. But we got up early in the morning to see. Satan was converted, you see. Well, the rest followed. Joan rode up and down that camp, and wherever that fair young form appeared in its shining armor, with that sweet face to grace the vision and perfect it, the rude host seemed to think they saw the god of war in person, descended out of the clouds. and first they wondered, then they worshipped. After that she could do with them what she would. In 3 days it was a clean camp and orderly, and those barbarians were herding to divine service twice a day like good children. The women were gone. La Hire was stunned by these marvels. He could not understand them. He went outside the camp when he wanted to swear. He was that sort of a man, sinful by nature and habit, but full of superstitious respect for holy places. The enthusiasm of the Reformed army for Joan, its devotion to her, and the hot desire she had aroused in it to be led against the enemy, exceeded any manifestations of this sort which La Hire had ever seen before in his long career. His admiration of it all, and his wonder over the mystery and miracle of it, were beyond his power to put into words. He had held this army cheap before, but his pride and confidence in it knew no limits now. He said,
2 or 3 days ago it was afraid of a hen roost. One could storm the gates of hell with it now.
Joan and he were inseparable, and a quaint and pleasant contrast they made. He was so big, she so little. He was so gray and so far along in his pilgrimage of life, she so youthful. His face was so bronzed and scarred, hers so fair and pink, so fresh and smooth. She was so gracious, and he so stern. She was so pure, so innocent, he such a cyclopedia of sin. In her eye was stored all charity and compassion, in his lightnings. When her glance fell upon you it seemed to bring benediction and the peace of God, but with his it was different, generally. They rode through the camp a dozen times a day, visiting every corner of it, observing, inspecting, perfecting. And wherever they appeared the enthusiasm broke forth. They rode side by side, he a great figure of brawn and muscle, she a little masterwork of roundness and grace, he a fortress of rusty iron, she a shining statuette of silver. And when the reformed raiders and bandits caught sight of them they spoke out, with affection and welcome in their voices, and said, "There they come, Satan and the page of Christ." All the 3 days that we were in Blois, Joan worked earnestly and tirelessly to bring La Hire to God, to rescue him from the bondage of sin, to breathe into his stormy heart the serenity and peace of religion. She urged, she begged, she implored him to pray. He stood out 3 days of our stay, begging about piteously to be let off from just that one thing, that impossible thing. He would do anything else, anything. Command and he would obey. He would go through the fire for her, if she said the word. But spare him this, only this, for he couldn't pray, had never prayed. He was ignorant of how to frame a prayer. He had no words to put it in. And yet, can any believe it? She carried even that point. She won that incredible victory. She made La Hire pray. It shows, I think, that nothing was impossible to Joan of Arc. Yes, he stood there before her and put up his mailed hands and made a prayer. And it was not borrowed, but was his very own. He had none to help him frame it. He made it out of his own head, saying, "Fair Sir God, I pray you to do by La Hire as he would do by you if you were La Hire and he were God." Footnote number 1. This prayer has been stolen many times and by many nations in the past 460 years, but it originated with La Hire, and the fact is of official record in the National Archives of France. We have the authority of Michelet for this. Translator. End of footnote number 1. Then he put on his helmet and marched out of Joan's tent, as satisfied with himself as anyone might be who had arranged a perplexed and difficult business to the content and admiration of all the parties concerned in the matter. If I had known that he had been praying, I could have understood why he was feeling so superior, but of course I could not know that. I was coming to the tent at that moment, and saw him come out, and saw him march away in that large fashion, and indeed it was fine and beautiful to see. But when I got to the tent door I stopped and stepped back, grieved and shocked, for I heard Joan crying, as I mistakenly thought, crying as if she could not contain nor endure the anguish of her soul, crying as if she would die. But it was not so. She was laughing at La Hire's prayer. It was not until 36 years afterward that I found that out, and then Oh, then I only cried when that picture of young carefree mirth rose before me out of the blur and mists of that long vanished time. For there had come a day between, when God's good gift of laughter had gone out from me to come again no more in this life. End of chapter 12. Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain. Volume 1, Book 2, Chapter 13. Checked by the Folly of the Wise. We marched out in great strength and splendor, and took the road toward Orleans. The initial part of Joan's great dream was realizing itself at last. It was the first time that any of us youngsters had ever seen an army, and it was a most stately and imposing spectacle to us. It was indeed an inspiring sight, that interminable column, stretching away into the fading distances and curving itself in and out of the crookedness of the road like a mighty serpent. Joan rode at the head of it with her personal staff. Then came a body of priests singing the Veni Creator, the banner of the cross rising out of their midst. After these, the glinting forest of spears. The several divisions were commanded by the great Armagnac generals, La Hire and Marshal de Boussac, the Sire de Retz, Florent de Liers, and Poton de Saint-Rey. Each in his degree was tough, and there were 3 degrees: tough, tougher, toughest. And La Hire was the last by a shade, but only a shade. They were just illustrious official brigands, the whole party, and by long habits of lawlessness they had lost all acquaintanceship with obedience, if they had ever had any. But what was the good of saying that? These independent birds knew no law. They seldom obeyed the king. They never obeyed him when it didn't suit them to do it. Would they obey the maid? In the first place, they wouldn't know how to obey her or anybody else, and in the second place, it was of course not possible for them to take her military character seriously, that country girl of 17 who had been trained for the complex and terrible business of war. How? By tending sheep. They had no idea of obeying her except in cases where their veteran military knowledge and experience showed them that the thing she required was sound and right when gauged by the regular military standards. Were they to blame for this attitude? I should think not. Old war-worn captains are hard-headed practical men. They do not easily believe in the ability of ignorant children to plan campaigns and command armies. No general that ever lived could have taken Joan seriously, militarily, before she raised the siege of Orleans and followed it with the great campaign of the Loire. Did they consider Joan valueless? Far from it. They valued her as the fruitful earth values the sun. They fully believed she could produce the crop, but that it was in their line of business, not hers, to take it off. They had a deep and superstitious reverence for her as being endowed with a mysterious supernatural something that was able to do a mighty thing which they were powerless to do, blow the breath of life and valor into the dead corpses of cowed armies and turn them into heroes. To their minds they were everything with her, but nothing without her. She could inspire the soldiers and fit them for battle, but fight the battle herself? Oh, nonsense, that was their function. They, the generals, would fight the battles. Joan would give the victory. That was their idea, an unconscious paraphrase of Joan's reply to the Dominican. So they began by playing a deception upon her. She had a clear idea of how she meant to proceed. It was her purpose to march boldly upon Orleans by the north bank of the Loire. She gave that order to her generals. They said to themselves, "The idea is insane. It is blunder number 1. It is what might have been expected of this child who is ignorant of war." They privately sent the word to the Bastard of Orleans. He also recognized the insanity of it, and privately advised the generals to get around the order in some way. They did it by deceiving Joan. She trusted those people. She was not expecting this sort of treatment, and was not on the lookout for it. It was a lesson to her. She saw to it that the game was not played a second time. Why was Joan's idea insane, from the general's point of view, but not from hers? Because her plan was to raise the siege immediately, by fighting, while theirs was to besiege the besiegers and starve them out by closing their communications, a plan which would require months in the consummation. The English had built a fence of strong fortresses called bastilles around Orleans, fortresses which closed all the gates of the city but one. To the French generals the idea of trying to fight their way past those fortresses and lead the army into Orleans was preposterous. They believed that the result would be the army's destruction. One may not doubt that their opinion was militarily sound. No, would have been but for one circumstance which they overlooked. That was this: the English soldiers were in a demoralized condition of superstitious terror. They had become satisfied that the Maid was in league with Satan. By reason of this, a good deal of their courage had oozed out and vanished. On the other hand, the Maid's soldiers were full of courage, enthusiasm, and zeal. Joan could have marched by the English forts. However, it was not to be. She had been cheated out of her first chance to strike a heavy blow for her country. In camp that night she slept in her armor on the ground. It was a cold night, and she was nearly as stiff as her armor itself when we resumed the march in the morning, for iron is not good material for a blanket. However, her joy in being now so far on her way to the theater of her mission was fire enough to warm her, and it soon did it. Her enthusiasm and impatience rose higher and higher with every mile of progress, but at last we reached Olivet, and down it went, and indignation took its place, for she saw the trick that had been played upon her. The river lay between us and Orleans. She was for attacking one of the 3 bastilles that were on our side of the river and forcing access to the bridge which it guarded, a project which, if successful, would raise the siege instantly. But the long-ingrained fear of the English came upon her generals, and they implored her not to make the attempt. The soldiers wanted to attack, but had to suffer disappointment. So we moved on and came to a halt at a point opposite Chézy, 6 miles above Orleans. Dunois, bastard of Orleans, with a body of knights and citizens, came up from the city to welcome Joan. Joan was still burning with resentment over the trick that had been put upon her, and was not in the mood for soft speeches, even to revered military idols of her childhood. She said, "Are you the bastard?" "Yes, I am he, and am right glad of your coming." "And did you advise that I be brought by this side of the river, instead of straight to Talbot and the English?" Her high manner abashed him, and he was not able to answer with anything like a confident promptness, but with many hesitations and partial excuses he managed to get out the confession that for what he and the council had regarded as imperative military reasons, they so advised. "In God's name," said Joan, "my lord's counsel is safer and wiser than yours. You thought to deceive me, but you have deceived yourselves, for I bring you the best help that ever knight or city had, for it is God's help, not sent for love of me, but by God's pleasure. At the prayer of Saint Louis and Saint Charlemagne he has had pity on Orleans, and will not suffer the enemy to have both the Duke of Orleans and his city. The provisions to save the starving people are here, the boats are below the city, the wind is contrary, they cannot come up hither. Now then, tell me, in God's name, you who are so wise, what that council of yours was thinking about to invent this foolish difficulty." Dunois and the rest fumbled around the matter a moment, then gave in and conceded that a blunder had been made. "Yes, a blunder has been made," said Joan, "and except God take your proper work upon himself and change the wind and correct your blunder for you, there is none else that can devise a remedy." Some of these people began to perceive that with all her technical ignorance she had practical good sense, and that with all her native sweetness and charm she was not the right kind of person to play with. Presently God did take the blunder in hand, and by his grace the wind did change. So the fleet of boats came up and went away loaded with provisions and cattle, and conveyed that welcome succor to the hungry city, managing the matter successfully under protection of a sortie from the walls against the Bastille of St. Loup. Then Joan began on the bastard again. "You see here the army?" "Yes." "It is here on this side by advice of your council?" "Yes." "Now, in God's name, can that wise council explain why it is better to have it here than it would be to have it in the bottom of the sea?" Dunois made some wandering attempts to explain the inexplicable and excuse the inexcusable, but Joan cut him short and said, "Answer me this, good sir. Has the army any value on this side of the river?" The bastard confessed that it hadn't, that is, in view of the plan of campaign which she had devised and decreed. "And yet, knowing this, you had the hardiness to disobey my orders. Since the army's place is on the other side, will you explain to me how it is to get there?" The whole size of the needless muddle was apparent. Evasions were of no use. Therefore Dunois admitted that there was no way to correct the blunder but to send the army all the way back to Blois and let it begin over again and come up on the other side this time according to Joan's original plan. Any other girl, after winning such a triumph as this over a veteran soldier of old renown, might have exulted a little and been excusable for it, but Joan showed no disposition of this sort. She dropped a word or two of grief over the precious time that must be lost, then began at once to issue commands for the march back. She sorrowed to see her army go, for she said its heart was great and its enthusiasm high, and that with it at her back she did not fear to face all the might of England. All arrangements having been completed for the return of the main body of the army, she took the Bastard and La Hire and 1,000 men and went down to Orleans, where all the town was in a fever of impatience to have sight of her face. It was 8 in the evening when she and the troops rode in at the Burgundy gate, with the Paladin preceding her with her standard. She was riding a white horse, and she carried in her hand the sacred sword of Fierbois. You should have seen Orleans then. What a picture it was! Such black seas of people, such a starry firmament of torches, such roaring whirlwinds of welcome, such booming of bells and thundering of cannon. It was as if the world was come to an end. Everywhere in the glare of the torches one saw rank upon rank of upturned white faces, the mouths wide open, shouting, and the unchecked tears running down. Joan forged her slow way through the solid masses, her mailed form projecting above the pavement of heads like a silver statue. The people about her struggled along, gazing up at her through their tears with the rapt look of men and women who believe they are seeing one who is divine, and always her feet were being kissed by grateful folk, and such as failed of that privilege touched her horse and then kissed their fingers. Nothing that Joan did escaped notice. Everything she did was commented upon and applauded. You could hear the remarks going all the time. "There, she's smiling, see? Now she's talking her little plumed cap off to somebody. Ah, it's fine and graceful. She's patting that woman on the head with her gauntlet. Oh, she was born on a horse. See her turn in her saddle and kiss the hilt of her sword to the ladies in the window that threw the flowers down. Now there's a poor woman lifting up a child. She's kissed it. Oh, she's divine. What a dainty little figure it is, and what a lovely face, and such color and animation!" Joan's slender long banner, streaming backward, had an accident. The fringe caught fire from a torch. She leaned forward and crushed the flame in her hand. "She's not afraid of fire nor of anything," they shouted, and delivered a storm of admiring applause that made everything quake. She rode to the cathedral and gave thanks to God, and the people crammed the place and added their devotions to hers. Then she took up her march again and picked her slow way through the crowds and the wilderness of torches to the house of Jacques Boucher, treasurer of the Duke of Orleans, where she was to be the guest of his wife as long as she stayed in the city, and have his young daughter for comrade and roommate. The delirium of the people went on the rest of the night, and with it the clamor of the joy bells and the welcoming cannon. Joan of Arc had stepped upon her stage at last, and was ready to begin.
So after listening to these 2 chapters, I started to think, okay, I wonder if it wasn't when Twain stumbled upon this actual historical person, La Hire, the guy who swears all the time. I wonder if it wasn't discovering him that made Twain suddenly say, you know what, I could do historical fiction. As long as I've got this guy in it, I could totally do this. Because this prayer of his, I will do what God wants me to do as long as God is acting like me and I'm acting like God. Who comes up with this? I love this. He was a huge champion of Joan's. He was so respectful. He was so broken at the end of the story. But both La Hire and then the Bastard of Orleans wound up being 2 of her staunchest defenders and protectors, which is really, it's just cool. All of the chapters today were true. The end. enough said. So with that, I am going to leave you because there's nothing else. And I've got to go get ready for Pride and for work before that. So you have a great week and take care of yourself and stay healthy. We're making more and more calls again to people who are really very sick. I know the press has been saying that Omicron is COVID light, L-I-T-E. It is not. People who are vaccinated are getting really sick. The difference is they're not going to the hospital and they're not dying. That seems to be the biggest difference. But that doesn't mean that people aren't getting really sick. During Delta, it seemed like the loss of taste and smell had kind of stopped happening. It's coming back. There are new symptoms since Delta, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Who wants that? No one. I am still wearing a mask when I am in any place that is crowded and has low ceilings. So on election day, I wore my mask anytime I was moving around. But when I was sitting at our table, we still are behind a plastic partition. So the other mom and I who work together, we know what we do out in the world, and that's nothing. So when nobody else was there and it was just the two of us talking, we did sit there without our masks on and talk. We are also voting in the hall of a church, the ceiling of which is easily 25 feet at the highest point and is covered with ceiling fans. So the air is moving constantly. There's plenty of room for the air to move in. And I felt very comfortable talking to her like that with our masks off. When we went to the table to count votes and there were a bunch of us sitting next to each other, my mask went right back on. And anytime I talked to voters, when I came out from behind the partition and talked to voters, I wore my mask. Interestingly, I will tell you this, the people who wore masks to come in were not a few, quite a few voters came in masked, and it didn't matter which political party they were. People were wearing masks on both sides. And I thought, that's interesting, because last time everybody was complaining and wearing masks under protest. This time, there was no restriction, there was no requirement, but plenty of people came in masked and smiling. It was a very, very pleasant voting day. So, happy news for all. You be well, take care of each other, and I will talk to you soon. Have a good one. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.